We welcome you to this session, and it's our pleasure to conduct this webinar to share experiences with respect to science. And we are a training company, Geetha, which is our parent company is Gyan Data. And today's webinar is about thinking like a data scientist, which will be given by Ms. Aarti. And before getting into the webinar, I just would like to give a short intro about Aarti. So Aarti, she started her career by working at Infosys, TCS, iGate, and Carrick Stanley, and she worked primarily in J2EE technology. Actually, she did her undergraduation in electronics engineering from PSG College of Technology, and she has about overall experience of 16 years, and she has worked in varied verticals like retail, logistics, pharmaceutical, and telecom. She has played many roles such as product developer, technical architect, project manager for both large and small companies in India and USA. She wanted to step out of the comfort zone and explore her interest in content. She joined Think, it's pronounced THINQ, and education research group with the aim to help learners develop the critical thinking capacities and rational inquiry. She also spent a year designing math curriculum and lessons for a small group of homeschooling children. Intrigued by AI and wanting to apply her critical thinking skills, she joined Gyan Data Private Limited, an IIT incubated company in 2019, and she now functions as a project manager for AI and ML solutions. Apart from this, she is an avid reader with a wide variety of interests from philosophy to fiction to popular science. She's also an interpreter and a translator of German, enjoys travel and high adrenaline activities such as sea diving, snorkeling, and parasailing. So it's our pleasure to introduce Aarti to you. And Aarti will be giving an hour session on thinking like a data scientist. And following by, we'll be having 15 minutes of question and answer session. So in this session, we would request you to pose the questions related to the webinar that is being conducted today. And we'd also request you to pose the queries in between during the session over the chat window. So that will be addressed at the end during the question and answer session. So with this intro, I would like to welcome Aarti to proceed with her webinar. So please, Aarti, take it forward from here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sundar. So hello all, good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar on Thinking Like a Data Scientist. So let's start with the first question. What is data science? Data science is a field that uses statistics, data analysis, machine learning, and domain knowledge in order to understand some phenomena with the data and to extract knowledge and insights from it. Now note that it's an interdisciplinary field which requires a wide breadth of thinking. Now, the job of a data scientist is to be able to solve problems, have insights about what the data is telling us, and connect it to the business proposition that it offers your company or client. A lot of people come with the notion that a data scientist is someone who's well versed with the ML techniques, and that's all there is to it. But the reason I'm bringing this point about is your ML techniques are a means to an end and not an end itself. The end is the business proposition that you offer your company or your client. So this is the tech stack that is required for a well-functioning data scientist. You will be required to know a little bit about data models. You'll be required to know about how it is stored in the database. You'll be required to be able to access it using SQL queries. You'll be required to know programming and the IDE tools, that is your integrated development environment tools. Programming is typically Python and sometimes R. You will also be required to know math and statistics, statistics probably extensively, and math, particularly linear algebra, and maybe some basic calculus. And to top it all, you need domain knowledge. So this is the basic tech stack that is expected of a functioning data scientist. Now, just briefly give an idea, because this is something that people again often are confused about, deep learning, machine learning, and AI, and how they all tie up together. So deep learning is, the way we see it, is a subset of various machine learning algorithms, and your machine learning algorithms themselves are a subset of the larger field of AI. And data science is a happy intersection with all these three circles. Let's get into the mindset and roles of a data scientist. So what do I mean when I say mindset of a data scientist? So in that sense, it's not too different from an engineer's mindset. You have to stay true to the goal of solving a problem for your business user. You have to wear your stakeholders hat throughout the project lifecycle. Now, what does it mean when I say wear your stakeholders hat? It means from the time that you're conceptualizing the problem till the time you deliver your results, you have to keep constantly reminding yourself about what your stakeholder is thinking and how it's going to suit his needs. Key roles of a data scientist, and this is what we'll be talking in detail about. So the way I see it with my experience here is formulation of a problem statement, analyzing and presenting data, modeling the data, and presenting the finding. Let's get into each of these in detail. So when I say formulating the problem statement from the need, what do I mean when I say need? So the need of a customer is a raw statement from the customer about what he wants, and it can look like this. Say, I know I'm enthusiastic about AI, and I want to use AI in supply chain, right? This doesn't tell you what sort of data is there. It doesn't tell you what sort of processes they follow. But all you know is that they want to use AI somehow. So you get into their shoes, understand their process, take a look at the kind of data they have, and you make suggestions on where you think AI can be used. So I call these clients or these requests as AI enthusiastic requests. And then you have people who already have a bunch of data, who have some idea that this can be used. So they've already picked the field in which they want it used, and then they say, do some AI with it, right? So these are AI curious people. So they could be people who have car workshops, and they want to know what sort of spare parts are coming. So they give you the data saying this is the spare parts that have been coming over the last 6 months. Can you tell me something about it? And tell me what I can do with this data. Right? And then we have requests like, I want AI to auto-detect my needs, code for it, test it, and even deploy it, right? So I call this vaguely as AI magic believers, because at this point, the only way I can solve their problem is if I bring out my magic wand. This is basically people who have a misconception of what AI is and who have much larger expectations from it. So this is an amusing cartoon I found that I thought would be useful to demonstrate what I'm saying. So there's your marketing guy who says, can I use AI to manage a sales funnel for us? And your Alexa that's standing there, which is an AI product, it's saying, I found places that sell funnel cakes close to you. So this is a good example of the kind of narrow requests that AI can handle. For example, if you say, can you tell me places that have funnel cakes, it's probably going to be able to connect cakes to bakery and list bakeries next to you. But it's not going to be able to give you a strategy on how to manage your sales funnel. Okay. Let's go into clarifying the needs. This is my best case scenario where I have a client who really knows what she wants. So let's say your client comes to you saying, I want a device that can monitor health status continuously. So as a data scientist, you want to get down into the meaning of everything here and see if you can clarify it. For example, I'll start with health status. What do you mean you want health status monitored? What are the vitals you're looking at monitoring? Are you looking at heart rate? Are you looking at BP? Are you looking at oxygen supply? Right? And then what do you mean by continuously? Do you mean 24/7 streaming of data? Do you mean intermittent streaming of data, like once in an hour maybe? The frequency of streaming of data is going to dictate or it's going to be a constraint for the way I go forward. What do you mean by device? So let's say if it is indeed a continuous monitoring, like is required in an ICU, then you can have a large device that can actually handle the data and can probably give out alarms or give you a lot of graphs. What about if I'm monitoring someone remotely, right, where I'm going to get intermittent data? So let's say there are some aged patients who need care, and you probably want to monitor their vitals every few hours, and that you cannot hook them up to a device, right? So you probably have a wearable device, and that's probably going to be streaming data to your mobile app via internet, and then your mobile app is probably required to do something with it. Right? So this is breaking down the statement into into variables that can be measured. So that's what I meant by clarifying the need and formulating it as problem statements. Now, one useful question to ask at this point is, how does the client or the business user intend to use the outcome, right? So for example, in this case, are you looking at raising an alarm when certain vitals are crossing certain thresholds, like when the heart rate goes too low or when the heart rate goes too high? When you say raising an alarm, what do you mean? Do you want it to just beep? Or is this some sort of an Alzheimer person who cannot handle themselves, and thus a call has to be made to the doctor? So these outcomes sometimes help fine-tune your problem statements, and sometimes they will require that you in fact reformulate your problem statement. So this is a very important step in your project, and inadequately formed problem statement can be very costly. It can lead to a lack of clear goals. It can lead to a lot of rework. So you have to spend a lot of time in understanding this. So firstly, when you look at a problem statement, there could be some unstated variables that impact the process, and that's something you may have to uncover while talking to your client. You may have to think in terms of measurable variables to formulate the problem statements. Quantifiable variables, for example, when they say continuously, do you mean 1 hour? Do you mean every 2 hours? Do you mean 24/7? When you say health status, do you mean heart rate? Do you mean BP, right? So those are measurable variables. Then you have to break the statement down to sub-problems such that each can be solved. And solving the sub-problems would mean your entire statement is taken care of. You need a broad understanding of the domain area. Now, this example that we gave was something about the human body, so we already have a good understanding of it. But what if it was something to do with tire manufacturing, and I'm not from a manufacturing background? I would have to quickly read up as much as I can about the domain before I go talk to the specialist. And if you're a student looking at getting into this, a good way to gain this ability is to read widely. A measure of success. This is something you want to talk upfront while your problem is being formulated. The reason I say is this again brings a lot of goal settings in your project, and this can, from a project execution perspective, this can be a sign of criteria, so you know where you're heading and your client and you are on the same page. So an example is, I want you to classify defects with 90% accuracy, and who's going to tell me my results are correct? It's going to be validated by the domain expert, right? So I'm going to give you my result, and the domain expert looks at it and says, well, 90 out of 100 times you've got it right, and that's our target. But at this point, I want to add this, where is this target 90 coming from? I mean, is your business user just pulling this 90 out of a hat? I mean, does it make sense? Given the kind of data you have, or given the kind of problem you're looking at solving, is 90% a realistic number, right? So most often I see that these are just numbers that are pulled out of a hat, right? So it's possible that it's a achievable goal, and sometimes it's happened that it's not an achievable goal, and in which case you would want to talk about this right in the beginning, saying that why 90%? Is it that when a human does it, you're able to get it right 80% of the time, and are you looking at AI improving your experience and taking it to a 90%? So these are the kind of discussions you should have right at the beginning. And then you have certain kind of systems that are not very easy to measure success for. An example would be your recommender system. When I say recommender system, it's something like your Netflix or your Amazon, which makes recommendations based on the books you buy. So you buy a book and it says if you bought book A, you're likely to like book B, C. Let's say there is a recommendation system A in place, and I have made a new model and I'm replacing it with a recommendation system B. How do I know that B is actually better than A, other than an intuitive feel or a gut feel, right? So having a quantitative measure of success is something you should strive for. So let's get into data analysis. So before that, quickly, and to reiterate what I've been saying, there's this famous saying that if you gave an intelligent man 1 hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes solving it. While I don't completely agree with the ratio of split, I think it brings an important point that you have to spend a lot of time in formulating your problem statements, a lot of time in thinking about the problem. Yeah. So let's say we've done that well. The next stage is data analysis, right? So let's start with the important aspects of the data set. Now you would think that given we've crossed the hurdle of formulation of a problem, that your data would be available. But and we've had experience where we actually couldn't get our hands on the data because it had something to do with the IP rights and the client was very skeptical about sharing it. Or you're required to go there and be physically present because the data is so secretive that it cannot be shared outside. Sometimes there's a difficulty in accessing because the team that comes to you for the project is a different team from one that's going to be in charge of the data, and there could be clashes between them. It's also possible that the data is stored in a manner that makes it very difficult to retrieve, or in a manner that makes it very difficult to do data engineering. So these are all real issues that we face. So these are all questions that you would want to ask, right in the beginning of the project. So let's say we do get the data, right? Now we have to look at it to see how good it is. So, there are various kinds of variables. You have quantitative variables, you have categorical variables. So you look at that and try to understand, make meaning, what does the variable mean, right? You need to know that. And you may have empty values, and these are null values. So you have to know how to replace it. If there's a lot of data, can I just eliminate the values? If by eliminating you lose too much data, then is there a way to make it usable? As in, is there a way to replace it with default values? Is there a way to compute maybe the average and replace it? So how you replace these values is entirely depend on what sort of variable we're talking about. And in certain domains, you have to involve the domain expert to understand how to replace these values. And sometimes you get values that are just numbers and they don't tell you the units. I look at a number and I know its weight, but it doesn't tell me whether it's kilograms, grams, or pounds, right? So you have to get these basic clarifications done. And then you have the limits of variability. So you could, for example, you're talking about 12 marks, then your variability is obviously between 0 and 100. Any number below 0 or greater than 100 has crossed your limits of variability, or it's not possible to achieve that. So what do you do when you see those numbers? Can you cap it? Are you supposed to make it 0? Are you supposed to remove it? These are all very specific to the kind of variables that you're talking about. So all this comes under data cleaning. Then we talk about sufficient sample size. So let's take an example when we are going into this. It's a statistics example. So let's say you see this statement published in newspapers, right? Some premier engineering college, they have interviewed people, and people who passed out in the year 2000, they are all engineers were making an average salary of 50 lakhs per annum. Now, if you're like me and a typical Indian parent, you're thinking, wow, that's the college I have to get my ward into, right? Because they're settled for life. And but as a statistician or a data scientist, you're going to ask, wait a minute, how did you get this number, 50 lakhs? Is it the average? Is it the mean of all the people who passed out in the year 2000? So let's say you ask the person who did this survey and he says, oh no, we interviewed about 20 people and that was their average salary. And then, so that's your question, is 20 a sufficient sample size? And then you can say, okay, so you interviewed these 20 people. How do you know they gave you their actual salaries? So while we engineers are fairly truthful and good people, maybe if we meet one another after 20 years in a reunion, and that's where this survey was done, I'd like to say that I'm doing very well, and maybe I'm not giving you the right data, right? So you have to be skeptical about the data you get, and as much as possible, see if you can confirm that the data is indeed true. What about the kind of people you interviewed? Out of the 100 people who passed out, who were these 20 people who turned out? Are they people who are successful? Do these reunions typically attract people who feel they were successful, and maybe leave out people who feel they didn't go that far, and because of which you have a selection bias in your sample, and the values you're seeing do not really reflect the salary of the population? And outliers. So let's say out of the 20 people you interviewed, let's say one person is a CEO and she's making something like 2 crores a year. That one data can actually skew your mean and give you very inflated results, and probably the rest of them are getting much lesser. So if you see an outlier, how do you handle it? Do you want to remove it? Do you want to cap it? So those are things that you have to think about, right? So there's another thing that we have to think about. So let's say that this statement, you did verify it, let's say the sample was indeed representative of the population, and all these engineers were being very truthful. Would you say, looking at the statement, if I put my ward in this college, just getting into college is will result in this person earning 50 lakhs? Would you call that a correlation? Would you call that a causation? So let's go a little bit into understanding what we mean by correlation. So let's look at this graph, right? On the x-axis, you see the number of years. On the y-axis, on the left side, you see the average cheese consumption. On the right side, you see the number of engineering doctorates awarded, right? And you see that the graph is kind of similar. So the number of civil engineering doctorates that were awarded between 2000 and 2009 is correlated with the mozzarella cheese consumption. Now, those of you from statistics are going to shrug your shoulders and tell me, look, that's just a correlation, right? And those of you who are not from this background are going to be puzzled and saying, look, that's absurd. Either people consuming cheese has something to do with people getting an engineering doctorate, or do people getting engineering doctorates end up increasing the cheese consumption, right? Is that even a right way of thinking? What is correlation? Correlation is a systematic relation between two variables x and y, such that if I know x, I can predict y reasonably well. There is no talk about causation here, right? It just means two variables are related to one another, and you don't have to make sense of it using causes. So this is a pure correlation. Let's go a little into, if that's correlation, then what is causation, right? So let's take an example. I need you to look carefully at the numbers here, right? So this is statistics taken from 1976 to 1979. The numerator is the number of defendants sentenced to death, and the denominator is the number of convicted cases. Now, when I say defendant, it means the person who attacked, your prisoner, right? And your victim is the person who received the attacks. You see that they have segregated it based on the race, and we are using the word white and black with due apologies. So the victim's white or black, and the defendant is white or black. And you will see that there's a question of, was there a racial disparity in the death penalty? How would you take this question? So if you look at the bottom cell, you can see 12%, which is 19 out of 160. This is the number of white defendants who were sentenced to death out of the 160 cases that were convicted, right? Whereas if you take the 10%, you had 17 black defendants who were sentenced to death out of the 166 convicted cases. Now, looking at this, I would say, wait, 12% of the time, it's a white defendant who's being sentenced to death. So if there is a racial disparity, it looks like it's the white who is being sentenced to death more. But If you look at the horizontal, right, which is a segregation based on the race of the victim, you see that 17% of the black defendants were convicted, whereas over here it's only 13% of the white defendants got convicted amongst, if you segregate it by the race of the victim. And over here it's very clear, if your victim is black, then and your defendant is white, there has been no case of death penalty. And whereas if your victim is black and your defendant is black, there's been a 6%. So in both cases, it turns out that more often it's the black rather than the white who's getting sentenced to death. So this raises a curious question, right? Because aggregating the data shows that you're more biased towards the white defendants. Segregating the data shows you're more biased towards the black defendants. So which one do I believe, right? So notice that those of us, and I'm sure all of us, have done sufficient middle school maths to know, to understand fractions, that when you add fractions, the result reversing, it's not really surprising, right? It's quite expected. So I'm going to call that the Simpson's reversal. So this whole thing is called as a Simpson's paradox, and it's quite a popular one. It's one of my favorite. But this reversal, I'm going to call that as a Simpson's reversal, and I'm going to say it's not surprising because, you know, capital A by B being greater than small a by b, and capital C by b, d being greater than small c by d does not imply a plus b over b plus d is greater than small a plus c over b plus d, right? And we know that. So what makes it a paradox? So a paradox is essentially a contradiction between two deeply held convictions. Your justice system cannot be more biased towards the white and towards the black simultaneously, right? So I need to make sense of it. So it's a contradiction in the conclusion that I'm getting. That's what makes it a paradox. So let's see what to do about it. That's where the question of causality comes, and this is what what story does my data tell? And this is something I picked up from the Book of Why by Judea Pearl, where he says, when you have these kind of contradictions, stop looking at it from just a numerical perspective. Try to get an understanding of what story your data is telling. So if you take a look at it, you can make out in Datify add it this way, that when your victim is white, the death penalty awarded is at 14%, and when my victim is black, the death penalty awarded is 5%. So there is indeed racial discrimination when, but instead of looking at the race of the defendant, if you look at the race of the victim, you can make out that, yeah, there is a racial disparity. It's just that it's much more obvious based on the race of the victim rather than the race of the defendant. So, and even within that, within the race of the victims, you can see that there is a disparity and there is a bias towards the black, right? So this looking and understanding data deeply is what Judea Pearl calls as causality. And he says this is essential because the human mind naturally build stories based on causality. In fact, one of the theories is that's how humans learn. We store information in the mind in terms of causal stories, and that's how we build our intelligence. So the reason I brought Simpson's paradox is it's not all that uncommon, and in fact, I found a business scenario for it, and I thought I'd briefly tell you. So this was a business scenario encountered by Barbosa, Costley, Amit Sharma, and Caesar in 2016. So these are people who are researchers at Microsoft, and they found that their product Reddit, the average comment length of the users was decreasing between the years 2008 and 2014. So pardon me that the graph is not very visible. So the x-axis here contains the years 2008 to 14, and the y-axis contains the average comment length. So if you see that the comment length has been steadily decreasing. Now, as product owners, they would worry because the conclusion would be that it looks like our users are getting less and less engaged, and we need to do something to engage the users. But these guys who are researchers said, wait, I'm not fully convinced that this is indeed the case. So let's segregate the data by the year which the users joined. So they segregated the data based on the cohort of users that joined in 2008, 2009, 2010, and they found something surprising, that indeed over the years, the average comment length that the user started with had gone down. For example, in 2008, people started, with a comment length of 200. And in 2010, people started with the average length of 190. In 2012, people had dropped down to 180, and by the time we were in 2013, they were only starting with 170. But having said that, over the years, their comment length increased, right? Which means the problem was not with the user engagement. The user was indeed getting engaged over time. It's just that the overall comment length of people using this Reddit decreased, and that could be something to do with a generational change, right? The usage of short forms that is prevalent now, that has overall reduced the comment length, and it was not something to do with the engagement of the user. So I thought that was an interesting business scenario to look at. So it's not all that uncommon, right? And this Simpson's paradox helps us in pausing and thinking, and seeing if there is another variable that's lurking, that's causing a confounding variable that's causing for something to appear so. So let's go a little bit into causality, not too much. This is often seen as a philosophical question. What is causality? And because we don't have an accepted, agreed upon definition across domains, this leads to a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstandings. So let's see what I mean by cause and causality with respect to data science. A causal relation between X and Y means that X and Y have a temporal relation, which means X precedes Y and X causes Y. And the word cause here could mean necessary causes. When I say necessary, I mean that Y occurs implies that X has already occurred, right? It does not mean that if X occurs, Y occurs. Whereas a sufficient cause means if X occurred, I can say for sure that Y will occur. But Y occurring does not imply that X has occurred, because there could be an alternate variable Z that caused Y. And then you have contributory causes. So for some effect, you need n number of causes to come together. And we know that this is one of the co-occurrent causes, and it's implicit that all of them contribute to one larger effect. So that's for cause and causality. So before we finish this part, I want to just touch upon the need for control and experimental groups. So this is again statistics, and you may ask me why I need to know this. This just helps you make sense of the kind of data you get, helps you design experiments, right? So long ago, I was asked by an educational group to take a look at their methodology and tell me what I thought. And this is what they did. So they had this new pedagogy for helping children learn math. And the way they tested it was they gave the kids a math question before the year began, and for 6 months they introduced this new form of pedagogy. At the end of it, they administered the same test, and if the test results improved, they said their pedagogy worked, and that's why the kids improved the scores. So this was my question: how do you know it was your pedagogy that actually helped the child improve the score? It's like, you won't know this for sure unless you had a control group which was very similar to your group but did not have the pedagogy. So we created another group. So we took another set of students from the same school, because all things should remain equal, so the same socioeconomic background and the same distribution of children, which means in a class you have some very bright, some not so bright kids put together, and you had the same test administered to both of them. So one is a control group and the other one is the experimental group that's receiving your new pedagogy. So at the end of 6 months, they both retook the tests, and the delta, the improvement that they had from the initial to the final, if your experimental group did much better than your control group, then you could say with some certainty that your pedagogy actually helped. So this is used commonly in agriculture. We call it split plot trials. In medicine, in testing drug effectiveness, we call it double-blind treatments. But the essence of it is the same, is the need for a control group and an experimental group. So having said that, let's move to the important part, that is modeling the data. So far, whatever I spoke was to do with statistical thinking, which is also a part of data science, and modeling the data is something that's specific to data science. So I found this thing which I thought was very amusing, so I put it here. So this is your machine learning system, and this other guy says, yep, you pour the data into this big pile of linear algebra, and you collect the answers on the other side. And this guy asks, what if the answers are wrong? And he says, oh, just keep, stirring the pile till the answers start looking right. So that's kind of what we do sometimes. We just keep swapping models and, hoping the answer starts looking right. But is there a better way of doing it? Choosing the right model. So a little bit about the kind of problems that we typically encounter. So we get a request for diagnosing faults. Sometimes we get requests where they do have a fault diagnosis with tagged fault or not fault, and we are asked to predict trends for failure in the future. We are sometimes also asked to classify faults. So these are predominant requests that we get. And we get both supervised and unsupervised data. So when I say supervised data, I mean that they already have, let's say, a set of transactions. They've marked it as this is a fraud, this is not a fraud. And all we have to do is make our model learn that, and our model learns it by looking at the variables, and then it's able to mimic it. But sometimes you get unsupervised data, as in they have the data and they have no way of knowing which is fault and not. Maybe if you picked up something, a domain expert can validate it, but he himself cannot go through it because it's millions of data. So what do you do then? Our first instinct is to try and convince a client to convert this into a supervised data set, right? See if it's possible to manually label it. The reason being supervised algorithms have much better accuracy. They are much more simpler to execute and more reliable. So wherever possible, we go for supervised. So it's only in case where that doesn't work that we have to stay with unsupervised. What is special about machine language? You may have seen graphs in your school days and college days where you have two-dimensional data, you have X and Y, and your graph models a relationship between two. But take your real world data, take something like the variables that go into efficacy of your fertilizer, right? And the variables that go into predicting the yield of your grains. They are so much more, right? They're not two, it could be like 10 variables, 20 variables. Or take something like image classification. The kind of variables that you need to describe an image or a video, they could go into hundreds. And machine language gives you that power to model the functions based on n number of variables, and it allows you to characterize multi-dimensional data. So that's what's special about machine language. Okay? Pick what works for a particular problem. So the first thing you do is you look at the data, right? And that's what I said, getting close to the data is important. You make some assumptions about the data. That could be based on your understanding of the domain, understanding of the variables in the data, understanding the distribution of data, or a combination of all these. And then you pick a technique that's worked for the same kind of problems which were based on the same assumption, right? So this essentially assumes you have worked on it for 3-4 years. So if you're a fresher, then you typically have a lead in your team, and you go to him saying, this is what I understood about the data. These are the assumptions I've made about it. This is what I understand about the domain, about the distribution of data, about the nature of the variables. Can you tell me, based on these assumptions, what has worked for you, right? So you pick a technique which has worked for problems based on similar assumptions. Now, what can happen? Your output can be good, your output can be bad. So let's see what happens then. So if your output makes sense, then at best, your assumptions are likely to be true. Why am I saying likely? Because this is not deductive reasoning, right? This is abductive reasoning, the kind that's done by detectives. You're looking at the output and you're saying, well, my assumptions are probably what led to this. Of course, it could be wrong. How do you test that? That's by running your model through a test data. So we'll go a little bit more into this when we reach cross-validation. For now, we'll hold off on that, but know that when your output makes sense, at best, your assumptions are likely to be true, right? And it requires verification. What happens if your output does not make sense? Don't just swap out and try other models blindly. Instead, go back and look at your data. question your assumptions. See if you can modify your assumptions, make sense of it, make sense of the data. And now you have a new set of assumptions, and now go back and see for these new set of assumptions, what models worked, and then rinse, repeat, right? So that's a scientific way of going about model choosing process. We sometimes also choose models based on the desired success metric. So, you may have already discussed the success metric at the problem formulation stage, let's say accuracy. We know that some linear models or some non-linear models may give you greater accuracy over linear models, so then you have to go with that. Sometimes your success metric is performance, in which case, you have linear models that probably do much better than your deep learning models. So if your performance is a requirement, and if that's your sign of criteria. And then you have complex problems. I mean, some of these are the complexity of the problem requires you to layer models, and where a combination of models where the output of one is an input of another. And sometimes the data itself is complex, like image processing, which can only be solved using deep neural networks. So these are all things that affect how you choose your model. Then we go into customizing open source algorithms. So this part, I would say, is quite similar to what a software engineer does. We use a lot of open source algorithms. We have to try and understand how it works, understand how to tweak the code and use it. Sometimes you use it as a layering over your original code, or your code goes over it. And sometimes you have to tweak, download the open source and tweak the open source itself as part of your solutioning. And this is something that requires a bit of software engineering hats that you have to wear. Cross-validation of models. This, again, is something I would say unique to data science. The closest equivalent that I can think of is my testing phase in software engineering. But over here, it's a little more crucial. It's a little more iterative. So it's a set of testing tools that we have, right? And why it's important is, again, go back to what I said. What happens if your output is looking good or it's making sense? At best, it means your assumptions are likely to be true. And validating your model is one way of testing it and feeling more sure about your model. So typically you have you divide your data into training set and test set, sometimes into training set, validation set, and test set. And the training set is used to train the model. And sometimes you have you set aside a validation set, which is used to fine tune the parameters of your model. And then you have a separate unseen data, which is called as a test set, on which you run your model. And if that gives an output that is in line with what you expect and which is in line with your validation set, then you know that your model is probably modeling the real world scenario. Now remember that your training set should essentially come from the same distribution as your test set should come from the same distribution as your training set. You cannot train images of cats and for image classification and then test it on dog photos. That's not going to work, right? So you need to know what you're classifying, and you need to have a set that with the distribution that is similar to your test set and your training set. And at this point, suppose your test set shows that you're not able to get a good output, and you're going to have to go back, and you may have to even change your model. And this is a bit of an iterative process, right? Your modeling of the data and your validation, they go hand in hand. Sometimes we seek validation from domain expert, especially if it's some sort of unsupervised learning algorithm, and it's very specific to your domain. And I'm trying to tell you that your compressor is failing, and there's a lot of physics behind it. And so I'm going to use the expert to tell me if indeed my result is accurate. So that's cross-validation of models. So at this point, it's a small point. You may have heard of this before: overfitting and underfitting. So during the validation, if you fine-tune it too much to the training set you're talking about, it may result in overfitting. I'm giving you a theoretical example. For example, I'm saying I'm going to talk about what describes a bird, right? And if you tell me, oh, it, it should have 2 eyes, 2 feet, feathers, and a tail, and should be able to fly, so you're giving a very specific set, which is going to do fantastically well for your validation set. But it may fail in your test set, which is expected to even pick up maybe penguins, which don't fly but are still birds, right? And in case of underfitting, you said, oh, anything with 2 legs is a bird, and you validated based on that, and then you realize that in your testing you're picking up 2-legged insects or something like that, which is not even a bird. So that's underfitting. I mean, this is a theoretical way of understanding what we mean when we say overfitted or tuned to the particular training set, and underfitted, which is not picking up what you're supposed to even pick up. So those are things you have to be aware of in doing these things. Finally, I know at the end of all this, you have a great result and you're presenting it to your client. You have to use some sort of creative visualization, because remember, you're presenting it to somebody who's may not be a data scientist. So they have to make sense of what you're saying. It should be easy for them to look at it and make sense, and it should be easy for them to take decisions with it. So you have to enable that using some sort of creative graphs. So here's where you need a lot of creativity. And keep in mind that you have to address the problem statement. And I keep saying this because sometimes we find interesting correlations, and we go into all sorts of researchy stuff and we forget what is of value to the client. So that's why I bring this question of, are we addressing the problem statement while presenting the conclusion? Keep that in mind, because as data scientists or engineers, we tend to get caught up in our own world, and we forget to come out of it and wear the stakeholders' hat when presenting the conclusion. So we come to the end of it. I'm just going to summarize what I see as thinking skills required for a data scientist. And so here goes. You have to be able to get a conceptual understanding of what you're taught. And when I say conceptual understanding, because you're going to be presented with a problem that is unfamiliar to you, and you have to distill the problem statement from that scenario and apply what you've learned. So this means a deep understanding of what you're taught. You have to straddle between methodology, which is your, the different kind of ML techniques, and your domain knowledge. You both go hand in hand. Critical thinking throughout the life cycle of the project, as you may have seen, from problems formulation up to presenting it, you need to wear your critical thinker hat. Thinking in terms of variables, limits of variability, correlation, causation. These are thinking skills that help you execute the project. This is, I would say, statistical thinking, but it's also valuable in data science. Curiosity. You have to learn each problem because they could be from various domains, and you have to keep up with the different ML algorithms that come up, with the various kinds of metrics measurements that come up. So you have to keep learning, and this is again something that as a software engineer you'll be familiar with, because every few years some new language comes, some new package comes, and we have to keep learning. You have to view the problem from multiple perspectives. You have to view, and that's something that as a general problem solving habit is good to have, viewing a problem from multiple perspectives. Developing a doubting and questioning mindset. I find this somewhat unique to data science, but it's also something, if you are a researcher, you would have. You're always asked to keep an open mindset, a questioning mindset. Be skeptical of the data that you have. Be skeptical of the data collection methods. Ask questions, and be skeptical of even the results that you're showing, so that you're not missing something, and you're not falling prey to confirmation bias, which means you see what you want to see, and keep seeking verification. Right? I find this of all of this, I find this the most critical skill to have. And of course, valid and sound reasoning to arrive at conclusions. So you need to have, this is something that's generally useful for life and particularly useful for data science. So yeah, I was hoping I would not exceed time, and I think I have. have, in fact, spoke a little fast and probably finished a little before. So it's been a journey full of learning for me. It's been an exciting journey for me, and for those of you who are beginning or into data science or wish to get into it, I can promise you it's going to be exciting, at times maybe difficult, but an enjoyable journey. So, yeah, thank you for your time, and we're open to questions now. So when I said veracity of data, I mean, is the data real, right? So in the example I quoted, it was about the salary of engineers, and I was saying, how do you know the salary that the person quoted is indeed their salary and they're not, conflating it? In real world scenario, for example, we have had data that has been it's not, in some cases fudged even because of some internal process. Sometimes we've had data that was entered wrongly, right? So there was a case when the two columns were switched. So you have to verify if your data is indeed true. And that's something that we often don't think about when we receive data. Yeah, so that was veracity of data. When did you decide you wanted to take up data science? So I was studying about correlation and causation, and that was from statistical thinking. And I read Judea Pearl's book of Why. There was a lot of talk about AI and how exciting it is, and I decided to take the plunge just like that. So Soumya is asking, I have finished engineering now. I'm interested in data science, statistics. In what areas should I develop myself to go about my master's in data science? Okay. I always think it's a good idea to work for some time, Soumya, to get a real world idea of this before doing your master's. But of course, if you can always do it after your master's too. So in what areas should I develop? So that's why I showed you the tech stack. As a person, if you're looking at being a hands-on data scientist, you would have to know statistics. You will have to know programming because a lot of our data science solutions involve programming, and some product development involves heavy programming. As in, you need to even know the OOPS concepts for that. You need to, and since you're from engineering, I suppose you're familiar with matrices and determinants, which means you have some idea of linear algebra. But if not, do take a course on that. So it's because it's from varied fields, it can be difficult to put together. So sometimes I find it useful to take courses like the way Geeta gives, Python for data science. So their course has linear algebra, it has Python programming, it has some statistics, so it has everything that you need to become a data scientist. But yeah, otherwise I've listed the tech stack, right? So I would say go about and learn, check off individually. This is what I've done, and that's what you need to become data science. And you have plenty of case studies out in the open which you can work on. Again, a cautionary note: they come with nice data. Believe me, the real world data is such a rogue. It's no way as nice as what you see in your Kaggle data sets. Rupesh is asking, are the roles of data scientists and data analysts well defined in most companies? No, it isn't. If somebody is going to ask you for the role of an analyst or a scientist, I would say please spend time talking to them about what they mean by data scientist, what they mean by data analyst. It need not mean the same across companies. No. Do you always have the privilege of working up close with a domain expert to give you a proper data set? How many mission algorithms do we have to be familiar with, and how do you learn them? How do you modify them? What are the methods for creative data visualization? So Pratibha, thank you. That's a good question that you asked. Do you always have the privilege of working with a domain expert? So the answer is yes and no. There are certain domains. So I come from Gyan Data. We predominantly work in core engineering domain. So we don't have a choice but to look at domain experts because a lot of our modeling is constrained by engineering physics. But having said that, there are a lot of domains where you don't need, like, maybe you're talking about, we've done some agricultural data sets where we didn't have a domain expert. I'm sure you have some sort of retail customers, banking customers where you won't have as much hand holding and as much need for a domain expert. So in those cases, you would have to self-read, right? That's why I said the ability to read and digest is important to being a data scientist. And when I say proper data set, you can take it for granted that when you come to work, you're not going to get decent data sets, right? So you're going to spend a lot of time formulating the problem statement, a lot of time cleaning your data set and making it usable. A lot of to and fro with the client and you saying, can you get this clean? Can you get this sorted? And at some point, the client will throw in the hat and say, this is all I can do. Please work with this, right? So that's a real life scenario. How many mission algorithms do we have to be familiar with? Look, I'm really glad you brought this up. A lot of people in the interviews we've gone to, they seem to have read, 10, 20 mission algorithms, but they know everything from very shallow perspective. I'll say pick few. Start with supervised learning algorithms because that's what you mostly use. Even if you know just basic regression, right? Understand it deeply. I think that's essential. Anything you take, go deeply into it. There's plenty of material available to do it. Get an understanding of how ML works, right? You don't have to aim for, I need to know regression, I need to know random forest, I need to know SVN, I need to know deep learning. No, not necessary. Start with the simple linear models, maybe add a non-linear model, start with just supervised data, but be very good at that, right? Get very deep into that. And once you figure this out, you can learn any ML. That's what I feel. What are the methods for creative data visualization? You have a lot of tools these days that you can self-learn. What you can't learn is the creativity. So there are people who seem much more natural at presenting these things, and I don't know. Work on improving your creativity. Maybe do some art. Maybe that helps your brain's creative side. So yeah. So I don't know what is the medicine for improving creativity, but for data visualization, there's plenty of packages that you can work with. Ramachandran says, I finished my first year in MTech Chemical. I'm interested in data science. Is it too late? Not at all. A whole lot of the guys who work in my company are chemical engineers. In fact, the co-founders of this company are chemical engineering professors. So I don't know if it is by chance, but from the people when we go for interviewing, somehow we end up picking more chemical engineers than others. So no, it's not too late. Please don't think that way. I think data science is a fairly new field. There aren't so many people who've had a degree in data science. So most people who jump in do come from engineering statistics. So no, you are in the right field. All you need to do is brush up your linear algebra, go learn some statistics, go learn some ML, go learn some programming, and you're good to go, right? And sure, you can. If you've had some, if you've done some work, go ahead and apply to Geetha and Gyandata too. Okay. And your chemical engineering base will be very useful as a domain knowledge when it comes to providing solutions for core engineering companies. I'm a mobile handset developer with 10 years experience. For someone like me, getting into data science will be like starting from scratch. So it depends on what you mean by getting into data science. Do you want to be a data scientist? Do you want to be a developer? Do you want to start learning Python and doing this? Then yes, you are starting from scratch. The advantage you have is you come with a domain experience in mobile technology. And that can be very useful to go on this. But I would say maybe learn some basic tools and see if you can go as some sort of a consultant who will maybe be the bridge between mobile handset development and AI. So you have all sort of roles that are coming up now. If you're not a person with data science hands-on experience, but you have good idea of what data science is, and you're an expert in mobile software, you can lead consultancy teams, or you can be the interface between these two teams, right? So you have 10 years experience, so it's your call. I would say if you really care so much about data science, it would be okay throwing everything and getting into it from scratch and bringing your mobile software experience with it, that's also fine. It really depends on where you want to go. I'm planning to do MSc Data Science right after my final year BCA. Right now, I'm learning machine learning on Coursera and doing an internship in market research. Is it okay to do masters after final year? What courses are helpful in being a data scientist? How do you start? Okay, I don't know too much about what you learn in BCA. Is there Aishwarya, Satish, if any of you are more aware of BCA and how MSc in data science work, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Aarti, I don't also have any idea about this
BCA. Okay.
What the exact machine learning they covers, I also
Yeah.
doesn't have any idea. That's all.
Yeah. So Ria, it really depends on what your MSc data science course is offering you, and I can't say without looking at it. But I can tell you that that's not the only path. I mean, even if you did an MCA or if you worked in software engineering and then you want to move into data science, that's also okay. It's okay to do a master's right after final year. I don't know if I'm equipped to answer these questions because this is kind of personal. Some people have especially if you're a woman. I know we have certain years within which we are expected to finish our education before we go on to other duties. So it really depends on so many things. But if you ask me to set aside everything and answer this question, I would say I prefer having some work experience before I decide what I want to do with my master's. I mean, how do you even know you're going to like data science? I mean, you're really young. You haven't had experience working as either a computer science person. So maybe you could work for some time and see what you take to. I have friends who've done their BE, but hated development work, and they went on to being very successful business analysts. They've gone on to being very successful testing professionals. So you're quite young. I would say experiment a little bit if you have the time, if you have the luxury before doing a PG. But yeah, it's entirely depends on your life plans and goals. What courses will be successful? I think Geeta has quite a number of courses. I started their Python for data science course, and that's one of the courses that I would think is useful because it has a little bit of everything from the tech stack that I mentioned. Does having
can I tell about the courses?
Sure, Aishwarya.
Yeah. So Geeta offers 12 weeks online courses, and also we are doing a tripartite course with Stella Maris and Liverpool. So that will be a master's in data science, PG program, master's in data science. So you can look at our website. So we have published. So or else if you have any queries, you can also mail us at training@geeta.in. We'll send you the details.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good way of taking this, Aishwarya. Anyone has specific questions regarding courses, please look at the website. Please mail is it admin@Geeta or is it admin@Geeta, right?
It's training@geeta.in.
Training@geeta.in. Okay, yeah, you can please mail that. Aparjit asks, does programming knowledge alone give a home run for a career in data science? What specifically does a wholesome knowledge of statistics provide for data science person's perspective or career as such? Isn't a decent amount of knowledge okay? I don't know what quantifies as a decent amount of knowledge. So, if you don't give me measurable variables, I'm not going to be able to answer it. But having programming knowledge, does it suffice? No, it doesn't. So you need to have, is it necessary? Yes. Is it sufficient? No. So in addition to programming, you're going to have to know some amount of machine learning algorithms. You're going to have to know some amount of statistics before you get into data science. A wholesome knowledge of statistics provided. What does it mean to say wholesome knowledge of statistics? Okay. you'd have to sign up for a course for me to go into details of that. There are some good things on YouTube that you can watch, or if you sign up for a course, then you'll get an understanding of what is required. So I think there's I forgot the person's name. I'll have to send I mean, if you maybe put your mail ID, maybe I could send you. There's a list of stats videos in YouTube that you can see to get an understanding of what I mean by stats, so that you can see if it's something you would take to, right? Typically, what we've seen here is hypothesis testing and your t-test, your one-tail test, two-tail test, that kind of stuff for hypothesis testing. And programming is part of it, necessary, not sufficient. And for knowledge, it's something rather than saying, I'm not going to say you need to be an expert in, telecom, in banking, in agriculture before you even get into data science. I'm saying you need the ability to go across domains comfortably if you want to be in data science, because you're going to have a short time within which you're going to read a lot and scale up, and you talk to an expert. And this is something that's real, guys. When we talk to experts, we realize that they are so entrenched in their field, they don't know sometimes how to come out and give us, as a lay person, to explain it to us in a way we understand. So typically what my team and I do is, before we go into a meeting, we quickly look up the technical words that is required for that field, and try to have a grasp on that, because we know they're going to throw it around, and we don't want to be at a loss. Our job responsibilities in data science are segregated in data science verticals. I understand that there is a need to know it, but are there modelers who do only modeling and presentation guys who are only into data presentation? Actually, in some companies, yes. I've gone for some data science meetups where I was actually told that they have separate data engineering team that is expected to do only data engineering, right? By data engineering, I mean pipelining, storing, your querying, all of that. They have machine learning engineers who only work on machine learning. So these are the guys who are expected to know the calculus and the linear algebra. And then you have data science guys, and these are the guys who are expected to run it through the model and make visualization. So often they use data science as data visualization. So yes, there are places where the roles are clearly segregated, and especially if you go into maybe a data science product company, these are the kind of segregations you'll see. But the place where I work, we function as people who develop products, as people who do consultancy, as people who do projects for clients. In my company, it's not segregated. We would actually expect a person to know a bit of everything, or to be able to learn all of it. So we're a small company, so we don't have such segregations. But yeah, I am aware that there are companies where such segregations are done. I'm currently doing BSc Statistics. Is there any course you would recommend to pursue during my graduation? Shruti, you're asking a company that's doing training in data science, so you already know what my answer is going to be, right? There are courses that Geeta recommends, and I'd recommend you try. If you want to explore what data science looks like, you could always, like they say, there's plenty in Coursera and in YouTube. Take a look at it, see if it is something you connect to, and if it is something you would like to pursue, really, then, and within a time constraint, then signing up for a course helps, because there's somebody who's who's helping you with your queries. You're having tests to make sure that you have indeed understood. You have case studies here that you will work on. But maybe you should explore the open source courses available, to just get a feel for what is it you're signing up for. It's not that you sign up for something and you sit here and say, oh my God, they're doing matrices and determinants, I didn't sign up for this. So that's what I mean by, take a look at what's available, see if it appeals to you, and if you're serious about it, then I'd recommend taking the courses with Geeta. Ria's asking, BCA covers all programming. Oh yeah, so you are the same person who asked about that, as well as basis of software engineering. So Ria, again, that's good to know. You're covering a basis of programming, which means you're ready to function as a programmer. So the question is, are you interested in data science? Do you want to spend some time working as a software engineer, or as before you actually get into data science? It's really up to you. I would personally take the chance and work for some time and figure out where I want to go, because you said you're BCA, which means you're really, really young. You're just 21. I'm not fully sure how you decided on data science, so it really depends on that. What kind of accuracy is typically asked by clients? So Sahij, that is widely varying. I've had clients who have asked for accuracies that we knew, or that it has happened that they've asked for 95%, and due to various reasons, due to various constraints in the data itself, such a percentage was not even possible. And sometimes we get told that as humans we are achieving 70% accuracy. We want you to beat that. Now notice that I have no way of knowing if he's saying the truth. I mean, he's saying 70% is what he's achieved. I have no way of knowing it, right? I have to take him by his word, and then say I'm going to try and beat that 70%. So which means my basic meet criteria for signing off the project will be at least 70%, but the expectation will be bordering around 80%. So it really varies. It depends on the clients. It depends on also how knowledgeable the client is about their data, because sometimes they give you data which is so bad that they themselves say, yeah, look, we know that this is not good, right? But just tell me what you're getting out of it. So it's widely variant, and yeah, often unreasonable accuracy is demanded.
Could you explain correlation in simple words?
Yeah, so a correlation is a systematic relationship between two variables x and y. When I say correlation, I'm specifically saying that it does not imply causation. It just means that a good example would be the formula for your circumference of a circle, right? So there's a relationship between the diameter and the circumference of a circle. Are you going to say that the diameter cost the circumference of the circle, or the circumference of the circle costs the diameter? It's neither ways, right? It's just that there is a correlation that when one increases, the other increases. It's not a causation. So it's a statistical term. Causality, yeah. So causality, I'm not going to be able to do it in simple words because it's really not that simple. It's been debated for years. It's a philosophical question, and initially it was thought of as there are very few things in the world that you can say as causal relations, but now we are sort of changing the stance. And saying that that's what I was trying to list, right? When you have necessary causes, you have sufficient causes, you have contributory causes, and when you're talking about a relationship between x and y, it's causal when x precedes y. So x happens first, and followed by that y happens, and knowing one, I can say the other will happen. Loosely put, that's causality. Okay. So thank you guys for your time. Thank you for patiently listening to me on Saturday afternoon. And thank you, Geeta team, for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, Aishu. I know you stayed up with me to get my PPT in shape. Thank you so much for it. Thank you, Dr. Suchitra and Dr. Raghu, for giving me the opportunity. And I don't think these guys are here, but Dr. Shivadurga Prasad and Dr. Vignesh, who reviewed my presentation, who gave me feedback to make it better. So I have to thank and all my Gyan Data boys for. I work with an all boys team, so yeah, they have. I've learned a lot from them. We've had fantastic conversations, and yeah, I'd like to thank them too. And Sundar from Geeta, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot all for joining this session, and thank you so much, Harti.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.